So welcome to today's session. We'll be talking about low code, no code, and high code in Drupal, and we'll talk about different approaches when it comes to these assembly models. We're going to bring up some pros and cons, some challenges, and some real life examples when it comes to these assembly models. But we're going to start off with some introductions. So Alan, do you want to start to introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, my name is Alan Botwright. I'm a solutions architect at Acquia. I've been with the company now for 7 years, in multiple roles here. My relationship with Drupal goes back to 2007 now, which I think was Drupal 5 when I first started out. So happy to be here today.
Cool. And my name is Agnes Lind. I haven't been with Acquia or Drupal for as long as Alan. I've been with Acquia for about a year as a solutions engineer. So me and Alan have been on the same team for about a year's time, and now Alan has switched to another team just a couple of days ago. But we're going to be doing this session together, and I thought we could just start off by going through our agenda for today. So before we jump into the actual content, I thought we could just go through some key concepts of the things that we will be discussing, just to create kind of a baseline so that we're on the same page when we're using certain concepts. And then we're going to jump into component-based development. And then Alan is going to talk more about different assembly models in Drupal. And we also want to give enough time for any discussions and Q&A in the end. So we're going to run through the presentation and then try to leave at least 10 minutes for questions and for discussions. And as we go, you can also feel free to pop in things in the chat. One of us will try to monitor that, and we'll try to answer all the questions that you might have. So without any further ado, we can just jump into the key concepts. And this is just to give kind of a foundation of what we're going to talk about, as I mentioned. So all of these concepts are quite high level. You might be familiar with some of these. They come from software engineering, and I heard about these concepts for the first time at university when I was studying data architecture. So the first idea that I'm going to talk about is coupling. Some of you might have heard of decoupled or decoupling, but whether things are tightly coupled or loosely coupled has to do with how interdependent and connected different things are. And the best practices for coupling is for things to be loosely coupled or have low coupling. And that's how you get better reusability, higher stability, and that's also a way to test things a lot easier. So an example of that is Drupal, since Drupal is modular, and which is a good example of coupling practices. And so the next concept is cohesion. So in computer programming, cohesion is to which degree elements are packaged together or belong together. So that could be, for example, features or functions or methods or whatever. And we tend to prefer things to have high cohesion where there's a lot of internal structure. So things with high cohesion tend to be more reliable and robust. And again, this leads us back to the concept of reusability, which means that we can do more things faster with more reliability. But if we have things with low cohesion, you will have things that are difficult to test and maintain, and where you might not be able to reuse different things. And so if we combine those together and we take the best practices of both of those concepts, both of coupling and cohesion, we end up with the idea of composability. And composability is to which degree we can take components and assemble them to create the experience or application that we want. And what a lot of people think about when we, or might not realize, is that the opposite of monolithic is actually not decoupled, but it's actually composable. And we'll talk about that a little bit later with different types of composability models or assembly models that we have. But when we talk about this, we want to make sure that the component, whether the component is a web component, modules, APIs, or services or systems, we want to make sure that they're self-contained, that they have their own internal logic and structure, and that they're also stateless. So they can connect with other things, but they're not managing the state of what's going on, but they're simply just helping to coordinate and respond to different events. So that's also where we get the idea of reusability, that that's why you can, for example, put a block on a page, go put the same block on another page, and then have potentially different experiences with the same kind of block. And so when we talk about these best practices, monolithic is not necessarily a bad thing in general, but when we talk about problems that we face in software development, we really want to make sure that we're trying to move towards composability and away from monolithic. And the whole concept of monolithic systems means that everything is tied together, like we saw in the previous image. So it's really difficult to pull something out or swap something out and take something out and put something else back in. So we want to make sure that we're not tying ourselves in and making it difficult for us while we develop applications, for example. So overall, what we want to do is really to focus on a composable approach for building any type of application or experience, regardless of the technology. So as mentioned before, we want to make sure that components are self-contained, that they're stateless, and that those traits are what's going to enable us to reuse those components over and over again. And what we've seen as another example is Drupal 8. When we use Composer, for example, now we're able to pull in packages and libraries from other projects, but we can also provide libraries and packages from within Drupal to other projects as well. Another example, which is quite a common use case for composability and something that will also, that me and Alan have seen a lot with Acquia, is that e-commerce is quite a common use case for composability. So we've seen quite a lot of times with customers at Acquia, for example, that building an e-commerce integration where Drupal is managing the content can be quite challenging. But when taking a composable approach, we end up with the ability for the e-commerce platform to do its own thing, and then Drupal to do its own thing, and then Drupal allows us to drop in the components that interact with the e-commerce components or parts. So e-commerce is really a good example in the real world of a composable application and how to make composability valuable. Because if we really focused on building monolithic applications, it would be quite difficult to do the same kind of integration and also maintain it. But if we take this loosely coupled approach, it means that you can shift and adapt, and you don't have to invest a huge amount of time and effort to build or to make changes. So if we talk about component-based development, we're going to look into some more, just another example of e-commerce or how that could work. So what we're looking at right now is just a basic wireframe for any e-commerce experience that you might find. And what we typically recommend to customers is to think about how to break each component up. So if we take a look at this next slide, you can see that everything in white here is managed by Drupal. So you got the menu, you got the views, the search blocks, for example. We have the layout being managed by Drupal, but then the pieces that need to be live or dynamic, for example, or pieces that need to be making API calls or are user specific. So my cart or my login, those are usually web components that are assembled inside of Drupal, and they do all the rendering also inside the browser. So you can also see, for example, personalization that could be done by Acquia, for example, or Optimizely or something similar. And you might also use other systems, like for comments, for example, you could use Discuss, or for social, you might use something completely different. So the idea here is that composable is not new, and this concept of Drupal doing this is not new, but it's very powerful. And there are other capabilities that are quite new that we could also use to enhance this and to make it even more powerful. So something that we highly recommend that's new in the last couple of years is the component module. So the component module specifically is designed to make it really easy for JavaScript developers to get their JavaScript web components into Drupal without having to understand PHP, for example, or having to know anything about Drupal at all. And the way that we do this is by providing a YAML file to Drupal. And this YAML file is automatically discovered by Drupal, and it's going to take the component in, see what component it is, and make it available in the system as a block. So you can place that block wherever you want. And then Drupal is going to take care of the dependency management, the JavaScript aggregation, the CSS, the caching, etc. And then you can put configuration options in as well. And that will be configured by a site builder. So then when the block is placed, the site builder can pass through parameters through to the component so that the component is displayed properly. And then you can use an assembly model. That could be Acquia Site Studio, for example, or a layout builder or paragraphs. And you can assemble these pieces on a page in the way that you want. So you're mixing these dynamic components with the Drupal content. And then the result is that you get the experience that you want. I'm going to go to this slide, actually. You get the experience that you want. And the great thing here is that each of these components, whether it's in this image, for example, the cart listing or the form for the promo code or different buttons, all of these pieces and components are completely independent. So you could take one of these components out of the page and the page will still work, or you can put one of these components on a separate page and that page would still work as well. And so this is why Drupal is really powerful, because it's a powerful assembly engine that helps us to put these different parts together. And what I've seen with customers as well is that this module in particular is very powerful. It's been a game changer that enables teams to do so much more with their Drupal sites. And I know in our team as well, as solutions architects, we've been playing around with the component module, and it's not that complicated at all. It's something that we just highly recommend for anyone who wants to build with Drupal, but also with other web components to make your sites more powerful. Alan, do you want to comment on that, or do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing as well, which we're going to get into next, is indeed this is a module built by Acquia actually that replaced the old progressive blocks module, which was like an earlier version of this. But the bit I want to get into next is really looking at how this type of approach supports different types of teams as well, outside of just the developers as well. Next slide, please, Agnes. So we're going to talk a little bit about assembly, and like this slide here. Yeah, this is the one. So typically now we get into projects as well. There's all kinds of different requirements and biases, like some examples here. Again, say no code approaches. So that would be like Drupal out the box, if you like, just as close to core as possible. Obviously relying on regular semantic updates, that kind of thing. And obviously that represents little risk for security or minimal risk footprint. So there's a bias there. Whereas on the marketing side, my priority is to be able to is agility, be able to put together experiences very, very quickly. So I want a bit more control outside of just simple content management. And then to Agnes's point earlier on, where we need to enrich that experience, and the example that Agnes made around commerce, where you're bringing products in, but you want control over that as well. And then from a developer's point of view as well, obviously that people here, there's a Drupal-centric approach in a lot of ways. But we also know that this ecosystem, if you look at the new developers coming into the place, a lot of that is developed from JavaScript developers. Something like 70%. I suspect it's even higher than that in terms of what's there. But also they have priorities, flexibility of architecture and connectivity. These are going to be priorities for these different teams. Next slide, please. So look at that a little bit more detail. Like we're really looking between the difference between high code, no code, and low code. And I think there's not that one of these is better than the other, but there's always pros and cons of everything. I would say from an approach of high code, so this is also, when we say high code, we mean decoupled as well. And actually high code, the reason we frame it in this way is because high code is actually describing the effort involved here. And if we look at your JavaScript developers being involved in here, there's a lot of coding, even for simple template management, that sort of thing. The plus side is sometimes you need a headless or a high code application. It depends very much specifically on the end use case, but where there's a lot of automation involved, and you can build something into an experience layer that doesn't require a lot of editorial oversight or minimal, and it's fairly fixed in what it does, then that can make a lot of sense. And we've seen plenty of applications out there. But on the other end of that, if we're making this decision based on just a preference for a development team, like JavaScript developers, then that may not necessarily be the right solution. We know that Drupal can support this in terms of as a structured content model, that kind of thing, but we've got to be mindful of what the success of the project looks like end to end, and that involves developers and security the same, and the marketing people, content people as well. So next slide, please. If we look at the other end of this, and this will say, in my first example, with security would like something as simple as possible, with some transparency around what code's going in there. Yeah, pretty much Drupal core out of the box, or a customized version of this that's using well-known contrib modules within this area. Now, this again may not be. Often people are looking for doing something that's a bit different for the sake of it, or sometimes known as vanity builds, where you're building a headless application just for the sake of it, and that happens. We see a lot of that, and the implications for that are deep for organizations where they have to support custom code, and often the people who wrote that code are not even involved in the project, or you're in your classic situation where what if that developer gets knocked over by a bus? That's something that doesn't happen, of course, but the idea being that standards, something that's predictable and updatable, represents low risk. But that said as well, just out of the box, Drupal is really useful for a lot of use cases, particularly for basic websites, even for basic applications. So we know that. Next slide, please. And there is some. Sorry, I've just got this slide completely around the wrong way. The previous slide. So that was the no-code one. Going back, so we go back to the previous slide. Agnes, I think your deck is looking in different orders to mine. So the low-code approach, and there's going to be some bias from this side of things. One of the things that Agnes started talking to was we've had a lot of success with looking at these hybrid architectures, where you're having Drupal as effectively an orchestration layer, and then be able to extend that and bring different types of content into that, different types of sources of content and web components into that area. Makes a lot of sense. So this is really the focus of the next few slides. Next slide, please. And probably the next one after that as well. Go back one. Back one again. Go back to the 3 circles. Yeah. Okay. So we're not really forced to make some kind of binary decision here as well. One of the things when we're looking at, say if we're looking at a headless approach, there's lots of ways of doing that. Obviously now Drupal out of the box supports a very powerful API first method. And there are other systems out there as well. There's some of you may be familiar with systems like Contentful, which is a purely structured data model, which you can build your own front end on that. And that's one way of approaching. So you're making a decision high up, which is we're going to go this way, we're going to go headless. Actually, where that Drupal works, it allows us to work with low code and no code that we talked about in the last few slides. Each of these can be supported, and they can be supported in parallel. Next slide, please. So we're not forced to make this decision, and I think this is useful as well. And the projects I've been involved with, which are allowing you to build parts of the site that are effectively single-page applications. They will also be powering mobile applications from the same structured model. And then you've got some other pages which perhaps have a lot more editorial overview, where they need to be able to make lots of changes very, very quickly and be able to introduce components into that display without having to involve the developers in that. And another point I was going to make earlier on was when you're looking from the marketing perspective, and this is where you need that quick agility, particularly, I mean, over the last sort of 2 years, 18 months, where we've seen the success of some of our customers that have been able to adapt very, very quickly to the pandemic and be able to make changes and very quickly respond to their own customers and customers as well. A lot of that was with the foresight to be able to think ahead, how to do this, and also understanding when we talk about the low code approaches, what we're saying is we don't require a developer to be part of an editorial process. And that's a key thing. So the emphasis with these different models is that understanding who we need to provide tooling to. So for example, within setting up your application in the right kind of way allows a content person to do a lot more assembly and orchestration on development. We don't need to do simple changes, have to involve a developer to do that. Now that works in no code, of course, but often when those experiences are rich, in the example Agnes made earlier on, where we need to be able to build a commerce system, and a commerce system is going to include a PIM, it's going to include maybe some transactional user information, and on top of that, it's going to include marketing information, which is likely managed in the CMS and Drupal. And on top of that, you go one step further again, where you've got the dynamic nature to that page as well, where personalization based on some first-party data that we serve, that's serving and personalizing that page, where that's served from and that may influence and change the page based on that. So we're building a list, this layers here. So within a hybrid low-code model, we can actually orchestrate and compose that page without having to go back through a developer necessarily. And in the meantime, the JavaScript developers, which are can produce effectively decoupled components that can be embedded into this environment through the module that Agnes described there on the component module. Or if you guys aren't familiar with that, I recommend you go check it out. It's really, really cool, super cool. Built by our very own Ron Northcutt here. It allows, what it does is it not only allows you to embed into the block system in Drupal, but it also recognizes that you don't need to know anything about Drupal to be able to introduce these elements, these components into the Drupal ecosystem. Next slide, please, Agnes. So it's also, I think with you can see here there's some bias here. We're talking about the hybrid model as well, and to reiterate that we're seeing projects that have success, and that including commerce projects, all kinds of projects that we're seeing that have taken time to understand this hybrid model and understanding where the responsibilities lie around, especially with development, what you can get out of the box as much as possible. And obviously, as Drupal people here, we understand what Drupal does very, very well. The structured data model, for example, that's there, some cache management, particularly like things I would say around workflow and permissions and that type of thing that we can have out of the box. And we don't want to be reinventing the wheel in this area. And be able to then drive those different types of experience from the front end. So straight away, the hybrid model is an easy way to do that because we're effectively using Drupal as an orchestration point. But also for high code applications as well, we can leverage that as well in an effective way without having to include aspects of this into effectively a rendering layer, which is silly and it's verbose and it requires us to do a lot more work. It's very hard to maintain, so the standards are very important within there as well. Next slide, please. I would say as well, like this is an analyst view of this, and the reason Acquia is saying Acquia rather than Drupal is because the analysts like Gartner and Forrester don't really look at open source directly from the perspective of companies. So you can switch out Acquia and Drupal here in terms of what the point of this slide really is shown as we know, going back to Drupal 8 API first, we're ahead of the game. As we've been ready for this model for a long time, and the investment that's been made by the community and the contributors through the community that have made this possible as well. But it goes to show that over the last 10 years, effectively, we've been on the right path. And even going back to Dries' original vision around configurability over custom code, and as we got closer and closer to that, and as applications become more and more sophisticated, ideally placed for the efforts of many people over this as well to be able to make that possible. Things like the component module, the maturing of approaches, recognizing how people interact with applications, the different stakeholders that manage applications, the different skills that come into that, not just us as Drupal developers and Drupal innovators, but also augmenting those experiences with different JavaScript frameworks, that kind of thing as well, and making this all work together well. And it's just fantastic that Drupal is allows us to ride this journey with the right tooling that's there, and adapt right across the board, and will continue to do now, as it did 10, 20 years ago, and as it will continue to do 10 years from now. Next slide, please. This is the final slide, and just looking at sort of a typical application stack here, and that's obviously from the perspective of the Acquia platform here. Your edge layer will also be able to support these various different component assembly models, where if you're running obviously a simple Drupal application end to end, but then if you're on the other extreme, obviously the high code side, where it may involve some kind of server-side template rendering, Next.js type thing, which we can accommodate on our Node.js layer, as well as the managed platform that we're known for. And a distribution of Drupal as well, which is the quick start Acquia CMS, formerly known as Lightning, as Acquia CMS, which similar spirit to that allows you to get off the ground nice and quickly and save you a bit of time. Some best practice in there is from some of the best Drupal talent in the business, putting that together, maintaining that. A lot of investment of time and effort from Acquia's side. On that point, Agnes, I hand over back to you for some Q&A.
Cool. Thanks, Alan. We haven't got anything in the chat yet, but if anyone has any questions, you can just put it either in the Q&A section or in the chat, and we can stay for a couple of minutes to see if there are any questions. I know there's still a few people on the call or on the session.
If no one's interested in talking about this now, then feel free to ping us during the event as well. We can pick up some questions or take one-to-one sessions, and we're happy to jump on different calls. And we can do we can get into a bit more examples, maybe customer examples, if people are interested. So we've kept this fairly high level and generic today. But there's some really good real world examples of this in action, and the sort of the value and approach and benefits.
Definitely. So if you want to, you can reach out to us on DrupalCon. I know you can connect with people through the profiles, so you can do that. Or I can't see anything else in the chat at the moment. No questions. So I think we can just round off here. And thanks everyone for listening. Thanks for taking the time, and hopefully we'll see you around at DrupalCon.
Thanks, guys. Enjoy the rest of the sessions.
Bye, guys.